Justice Thomas started the questioning of the San Francisco attorney.
So, what is with this permit? What is at bottom the problem?
What at bottom is the problem is that permit holders don't know what they need to do to comply. We know how to comply with the 300 pages of our permit, which tells us our discharge limitations that we need to achieve. The problem with the generic prohibitions is that they don't tell us what in addition that we need to do. And if I could provide an example of that. One of California's water quality standards is no objectionable algae bloom should form in the water body. San Francisco doesn't know how it must control its discharges to prevent that condition from forming in the water body. And we can't know because whether a condition will form in the water body will necessarily depend on what other permit holders or other non-point sources are adding to the water body and the flow of the water itself. What San Francisco can control is our own discharges. We cannot control the receiving water conditions.
Bottom line, by holding the city of San Francisco to water quality standards, the city doesn't know what it needs to do beforehand. The example given involves California's standard of no objectionable algae blooms. But, as Ms. Steele points out, algae blooms can be impacted by other sources of discharge. I'm not a marine biologist, but I believe other non-man-made factors such as temperature, tides, and migration impact algae blooms as well. So how can San Francisco be held accountable for an algae bloom that was not completely within its control? And how can San Francisco be held accountable if the EPA doesn't tell them what specifically needs to be done to prevent the bloom?
Isn't EPA, I thought the statute allowed for any more stringent limitation, including those necessary to meet water quality standards, treatment standards, or schedules of compliance established pursuant to any state law. So California has established certain water quality standards. Are those independently binding on the cities and municipalities in California?
They are not binding. They are only binding as a permit limitation. And that's the problem here is that they're only binding.
You have to have permits under state law so that they get bound. You get bound through the state permitting process then.
The permit issue here is issued by.
No, I understand, but I guess my big problem is that I'm trying to understand why you find these permit provisions so onerous or problematic when they seem to just incorporate standards that already exist under state law that you would have to follow anyway.
The standards are not self-executing, so we don't have to follow them anyway. They set the goals for the water body, but they're not limitations on us themselves. So they are not binding on us.
Even the justices are confused by this quirky setup. The state sets a water quality standard, but it's not enforceable and not self-executing. So a city like San Francisco isn't held liable for contributing to its violation. The EPA has to issue a permit to San Francisco to discharge effluent, a surprisingly controversial term we'll find used quite frequently throughout these arguments. And in that permit, the EPA is supposed to tell San Francisco what they must do to meet California's water quality standard. Seems like quite an opportunity for finger pointing.
Ms. Seeley, I mean, there are lots of different kinds of regulations in the world. Some people like some kinds, some people like other kinds. Some regulations are really prescriptive. Do this, 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 and this. And then, some people hate those kinds of regulations. They'd rather have regulations that are less prescriptive, that say, here's the goal, you decide how to meet it. That gives a party more flexibility and so forth. So, some people, it's there's got to be something in this statute that tells you that the agency can't decide to go the less prescriptive, more flexible. You decide how to meet it. This is the goal route. And I don't see anything in this statute that does that.
Yes, there are different types of regulation schemes. Now, when Justice Kagan focuses on people's preferred different types of regulations, I tend to think more along the lines of different situations. When she comes to a question, I think she unintentionally brought up an important point. Is the EPA allowed to use any type of regulation they aren't prohibited from issuing? Or does the EPA have to be delegated the power to issue a specific type of regulation? Sadly, this question was not answered during oral arguments. Rather, Ms. Steele focused on a point that I think she needed to make for her argument to work.
First of all, San Francisco is not the only discharger or contributor to the water body. There are 8 discharge points at issue in the
Those are the point sources that it's
Sorry, no. So San Francisco has its own discharge points, and there are 8 of them. One of them is, I will concede, is fairly far out into the ocean. We are the only source for that one. But the other 7 have many other contributors to the water body very close nearby. And if I can give you an example, just a couple weeks ago, there was a bacteria spike near one of those discharge points. It's a point that we are not currently using, so we know we did not cause that spike, but someone else did. Had we been contributing to the water, had we been discharging at the time, we would necessarily have been contributing to that condition, and we would be subject
But
to
how about
liability.
it? But
Justice Sotomayor seemed to be missing the point. She kept stating that the EPA was setting water discharge standards, then twisting what Ms. Steele was saying, as if San Francisco was trying to get the EPA to assign those limits differently. But Ms. Steele kept pointing to the fact that not all of the contributors to the output that the EPA wanted monitored was under San Francisco's control. What Ms. Steele describes would be like driving down the highway and being pulled over, cited, and fined not for your speed, but for the overall speed of everyone on that stretch of highway.
yeah, could I just piggyback on that if you'll let me, Justice Sotomayor? When I hear you speaking, I hear one of 2 things. One is that to the extent that you have objections to particular ones of these water quality standards, they're too confusing, they're too vague, we can't figure it out. How can you tell between us and other dischargers? I mean, that does seem like a classic arbitrary and capricious question. So you would go and make an arbitrary and capricious standard as to those particular standards that are in the permit. I mean, the second way I hear you, honestly, is you're making a policy argument to either the agency or to Congress. You're making a policy argument to the agency, essentially, don't take advantage of your statutory authority in this way because it's very confusing to us, the regulated party. Or you're making a policy argument to Congress. Go fix this statute so that the EPA can't do this. But what I don't hear you telling me is like what in the statute prevents the EPA from doing this.
Justice Kagan brought up an interesting point. The idea that San Francisco could be fined for violating a discharge permit based on the actions of others is arbitrary and capricious. However, that is not the case San Francisco has brought. Rather, they claim that the way EPA wrote their permit was not authorized by the law. Again, we see a justice apparently assume the EPA can write their permits any way they want unless prohibited by law. Now, Justice Kavanaugh seemed to sum up San Francisco's argument well.
And the overarching problem, I think, but you haven't gotten to this, so I'm going to give you, in terms of how this all works, is you don't know what your obligations are ahead of time, and yet you're on the hook for millions of dollars in potential prison time, even though you didn't know what your obligations were ahead of time, which strikes, at least me, I mean, it's definitely a policy problem, but one that's rooted in the statute. You don't know what your obligations are, and you go to prison.
How can the city be held liable for violating limits they are not made aware of ahead of time?